Hello guys, welcome again to Lost History of Eden. Okay, this video is looking at our second piece of evidence for evolution. So if you haven't already, go ahead and go check out our first video in this series on evolution and the evidence of endogenous retroviruses, what we call ERVs. If you haven't watched that one already, go check it out. Also, if you haven't watched our two introductory videos, considerations and fact versus theory, you really need to check those out before you jump into the rest of this site, because those kind of lay the groundwork for where we're coming from. So you want to go check those out first. Now, as I said before, we're looking at where to find the middle ground in where the Bible fits between science and myth. Okay, we have basically two spectrums, as I covered in my considerations video. One end being the biblical literalists, the young earth creationists, the creation scientists, those who essentially reject mainstream science and reject some legitimate science. They essentially throw out astronomy, geology, biology, everything. But there's some legitimate science in those fields that has been established, very well established, with good factual evidence. So it's a mistake to throw those completely out and try and shoehorn scientific evidence into your own biblical literal interpretation, i.e. making the earth 6,000 years old, trying to make the entire geological time scale fit within 1 year of Noah's flood, the things that just can't be accomplished. And that's what we're looking at in these videos. We're trying to establish what science is legitimate and where this biblical literalist idea has kind of went off the rails. Okay, so we're looking at evolution first. We're also going to look at the age of the earth and see how the earth has been established as 4.5 billion years old. But in this series, we're looking at evolution specifically. Okay, and as I said, we already had the first in this series about ERVs. This video, we're going to be looking at evidence based on biogeographical distribution. Just like ERVs, this, I think, is a very solid evidence that evolution occurred. There really is no other explanation that fits with biogeographical distribution than that we evolved from a common ancestor. Again, if biogeographical distribution is a mouthful for you and you're not sure what we're talking about, don't worry. It'll be explained in the video and you'll understand it by the end of the video. So let's go ahead. Let's jump right in and look at this evidence.
Okay, so we're talking today about evidence for evolution from what we call biogeographical distribution. Biogeographical distribution is just the idea that certain species that are very similar, that have similar physical and genetic characteristics, we see they wind up in the same locations. They're usually clumped together in the same locations. That's something actually that we would expect from evolution. Because species evolve in certain areas, and so they diverge from each other gradually, and so we're going to see similar characteristics among species that are closer together to each other. The best example for this would be marsupial mammals in Australia. Okay, everyone knows that Australia is full of marsupials. And that's very important for our discussion about biogeographical distribution, because this provides a really good evidence that evolution has occurred. So when we look at Australia, what we see is that there are multiple species of marsupials on Australia. And not only are there multiple species of marsupials, they're very, very diverse and very different from each other. We have the kangaroo. Everyone knows of kangaroos. We have koala bears. We have a marsupial mouse. We have a marsupial mole. We have a marsupial anteater. We've got all of these various marsupial species on Australia. And they are very, very different from each other. So looking at this diversity of species that is isolated on Australia, but yet contain the same unique characteristic of being marsupial, we can draw some conclusions about that that help us in seeing that evolution occurred. Let's look at what makes marsupials unique. We know they have a pouch. Most everyone knows that, especially with kangaroos. Everyone's familiar with kangaroos carrying their babies around in pouches. But all marsupials have this characteristic. And they carry their newborn infants in these pouches, and that's where their infants gestate. Unlike placental mammals, who gestate their infants inside of a womb internally. Marsupials don't do that. And so that makes marsupials very unique. 70% of all marsupial species exist on Australia, New Guinea, and the surrounding islands. So the vast majority of marsupials are on Australia. The few that aren't are on the surrounding islands around Australia, and an even fewer amount, a much smaller percentage, exist in South America and North America. North America, probably the best known example would be the possum. And then when we look at markers in the DNA of marsupials, we see that they have marsupials in Australia have markers in common with marsupials that are in South America. And so that shows us that they are descended from those marsupials that are in South America, that they both have a common ancestor. So in looking at all this evidence, the conclusion that we draw from the DNA evidence and from the wide diversity of marsupials in Australia is that apparently when all the continents were together in one supercontinent called Pangaea, marsupials migrated, just one or two species, migrated from South America across this continent to the area that is now Australia. After that migration, that one or two species wound up in Australia, the supercontinent broke apart, which occurred about 50 to 100 million years ago. When that separation occurred, Australia became an isolated continent, not in contact with any of the land masses around it. Once it became isolated, that one or two species that were on Australia then evolved into all of the multiple species we see there. That explanation, the evolutionary explanation, fits all of the evidence that we see. Now let's think about this from the aspect of the creationist explanation. According to creationists, all of the animals and their locations around the world occurred after the migration from Mount Ararat from Noah's Ark. Because according to creationists, all animals, all species that are alive today were on Noah's Ark and survived the flood that was recorded in the book of Genesis. After this flood and after Noah's Ark settled on Mount Ararat, all of the species dispersed from that location and went all over the planet. Since creationists don't believe in evolution, they believe that all of those species of marsupials that are on Australia couldn't have evolved from one another. They all would have had to have been distinct species as they are on Noah's Ark. Which means all of those multiple species would have had to have migrated en masse together to Australia. Now, presumably after the flood of Noah, Australia would have already been separated as a continent. these species would have had to have crossed a large body of water to get to Australia. So not only do you have these dozens of species of marsupials going straight from Mount Ararat to Australia without stopping anywhere along the way and swimming across the Indian Ocean to get to Australia and winding up on Australia together, none of them would have had to have stopped along the way, maybe broke off and stayed in Asia, because we have no evidence of marsupials being in Asia, no fossil evidence, no marsupials in Asia today. Yet that is the route they would have had to have taken to have gone straight from Mount Ararat to Australia. We have no evidence for any of this. All we have is a speculative story of them migrating from Noah's Ark altogether to Australia without stopping and crossing a large body of water to get there. This explanation is ludicrous. It's ridiculous on its face when we think about it. Everything we see in the evidence in the fossil record, we have fossils of marsupials in South America. We have marsupial species in South America. We have markers in the DNA of marsupials in Australia and in South America that are in common, showing they descended from the same ancestor. We have evidence all the continents were together and that they broke up 50 to 100 million years ago. We have evidence that that's the route that they used, crossing that supercontinent to get to Australia. Once Australia was isolated, they evolved into the many various diverse species of marsupials that we have there. The evolutionary explanation makes perfect sense. It fits everything that we see in the evidence, in the DNA evidence, in the fossil evidence. The creationist explanation makes no sense. It's a ridiculous explanation. There's not a shred of evidence to support it. So our conclusion is that the only explanation that makes any logical and rational sense is that all marsupials that are on Australia evolved from a common ancestor. That's why they all have that common trait of a pouch and of being marsupial. And that is one of the best evidences for evolution.
So you can see, again, we have a pretty solid fail-safe evidence that evolution occurred. Okay, there's no other explanation for the distribution of how these species show up in particular geographical locations other than evolution being the explanation. That is really the only thing that fits. Okay, so we got one more video in this series with one more evidence as to the factual veracity of evolution. So make sure you check that third video in this series out. If you're still kind of doubting whether evolution occurred, okay, that one should tie it up for you. But make sure, again, if you haven't done so already, you hit that subscriber button, okay, and get yourself ready because we got a lot of material on the way. We already have a lot up, okay. Again, if you haven't checked out our 2 introductory videos, Considerations, Facts versus Theory, make sure you check those out. Also, when you're done with this series, jump over and take a look at our series on the age of the Earth and the scientific evidence for the 4.5 billion year age of the Earth, okay. I thank you for joining us, okay, and you guys take care. We'll see you around later.